Hello and welcome. I'm Katie Shaddix, Communication Manager of the Cahaba River Society. We wanted to find a way to celebrate this special 50th anniversary Earth Day with you. So I'm here now with our Executive Director, Beth Stewart, and one of our board members, Dr. Jim McClintock. Dr. McClintock is a polar researcher and an explorer, an endowed university professor of polar and marine biology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, the official spokesperson for the national Can We Talk climate campaign with the Nature Conservancy, and a trustee for the Alabama Nature Conservancy. We're going to have a little conversation about this Earth Day, climate change, and the Cahaba and what it means for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Beth.
Okay. Jim, it's wonderful working with you on the board of directors of Cahaba River Society. And you're one of the top researchers of climate change impacts on Antarctica and what that means for the world. Bring that home for us. How is climate change impacting the Cahaba River, our drinking water source?
They actually tie what's going on in Antarctica, which is sort of the canary in the coal mine for climate change, things that are happening even here in Alabama and our Cahaba River. Amazingly enough, where I've worked the last 30 years in Antarctica is a weather maker, a climate changer. The Antarctic circumpolar current, the largest current on the planet, actually circles Antarctica and then splits and goes up into the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans in the Northern Hemisphere and has a huge impact on our climate. So you can't really divorce Antarctica from what's happening here in Alabama. And so what is happening? Well, we all know that we're getting more and more rain as it's warming. This is very basic weather. As the air warms, it holds more moisture. And as we all know here in Alabama, when it rains now, it pours. And we get a tremendous amount of runoff. And probably that's one of the major impacts on our Cahaba River is the fact that when we're having these rains, we're getting a tremendous amount of sediment moved into the river and all the impacts that sediment can have on a river. And we have the banks overflowing because of the high volume. We're having erosion in the river itself as a result. And this is really a problem. The other thing that connects Antarctica to us in the world of climate change isn't really tied to the Cahaba River, and that's that as the ice in Antarctica melts, we're seeing sea level rise. Now, so far, we don't have to worry about that as far as the Cahaba River.
What can we do to better protect our river and our drinking water from these impacts of climate change?
Well, if you think about it, it's all about runoff. And what happens is, which has happened for many years, is as we develop areas or in the watershed, we're essentially exposing the soil, and when heavy rains come, those get washed into the Cahaba and you have these sediment loads. The one thing, of course, is to work very closely with industry to make sure that when development does occur in an area that is potentially going to impact the river, that all the appropriate procedures are followed to reduce the amount of sediment that gets into the river. And that, I think with climate change now, it's almost like the rule book has changed. Those little black plastic fences that you see along construction sites were written before we had these tremendous rains. And so we have to really work on adjusting to a new world in that sense. All right, so of course, what the downside of having the sediments in the river is that there are impacts on life, on the biology of the river, the ecology of the river. Some of the animals that live in the river, like fish, are capable of moving and getting out of the areas with heavy sediment, and they're able to cope with those sediments in their gills fairly effectively, so it's not such a problem. But the invertebrates, which is a group of organisms that I work with, things like clams and mussels that have very delicate gills that respire by flow water. The water flow coming through those delicate gills can have a terrible time with heavy sediments. And it can cover them, it can suffocate them, and you can lose species. We probably have lost mussel species in the Cahaba River because of the sedimentation. So that sediment that gets into the river is a challenge for many of the organisms that live in it. All right, so of course, in addition to the impacts of just building in the watershed, having, let's just say you build a shopping center. It's not just the act of the construction itself where you get sediment runoff into the Cahaba River, but you also have issues associated with the fact that a lot of the area, once it's developed, is paved. And this means there's a tremendous amount of runoff coming off that pavement, and that water is not absorbed into the earth like it was when it was a forest, for example. And so this has a negative impact as well. So it's also about how can we build more sustainably so that that water is absorbed, and also when we have periods of drought, that there's water available in the river as well. So these are other impacts. Pollutants are another problem for the Cahaba River. Nutrients that you're putting on your lawn, pesticides, can get washed into the river. So that's something we need to be aware of. And in some cases, maybe think about mitigating. So all these things are combining to put additional stresses on the river.
Jim, you've been thinking about the links between the two crises we're in, the pandemic and climate change. What lessons are we learning, or should we be learning?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the similarities between the COVID-19 crisis and what's going on with climate change. And you may not think they're very similar, but if you start to dissect the scenario, there's some very interesting parallels. One of the things that struck me with the COVID-19 situation was that by responding to the crisis too late, a little late in the process, we saw a much greater impact. Many of scientists, medical people have mentioned that if America had jumped onto this problem earlier, the numbers of people that have gotten the virus and have died from the virus would be significantly lower. In other words, just a few months, a few weeks can make a huge difference. So I'm thinking about my work in climate. What we're seeing now is that we have been warned, just as we were warned about the virus, that these impacts of climate change are building. And we've gotten to that point, sort of at the end of this continuum, where we need to act now in order to have a huge impact on the amount of things that are going to happen down the road. So if we don't act now with climate change, the impacts are going to be much worse. We're going to have bigger storms, we're going to have sea level issues, we're going to have more issues with people with their breathing and with lung health. All these things are tied into climate change, and we need to think about acting now. I think the COVID-19 scenario is a good lesson for us to think about responding before things get any worse.
And you've chosen to be a teacher as well as a researcher and scientist. What's your message to young people, our future leaders, about climate change?
Yeah, as a professor and teaching young people biology, I'm encouraged. The students, the young people in my classes now seem to be energized about their environment more than they used to be. When I bring up climate change, they get it. They understand what's happening. Their level of concern about it is greater because they realize that they are the generation that's going to be dealing with the outcomes of climate. I get questions from them. Sometimes the students will ask me, well, I feel helpless. What can I do about this big problem? And I always tell people probably the most important thing you can do is to vote. You really need to exercise your power as an individual, talk to your legislators, and get to the polls and vote. That's probably the biggest thing you can do. And then I talk to them about the more fundamental things you can do in your everyday life, like riding a bike. If you have a car, get a car that gets high mileage, insulating your home, doing all the things that you hear about to help as an individual, because I believe collectively we can make a difference. And students are pretty good about collectives. They love to operate in collectives. And when they get going on their social media and things, it can be a very, very powerful message. And I'm really encouraged at my university where we have a very active group of students now doing sustainability types of projects for the community and these kinds of things. So I think young people make me feel good about the future. It's the status quo of the older generation that worries me right now.
Well, Jim, and as you know, one of the major program focuses of the Cahaba River Society is our clean environmental education program to raise our next generation of water protection leaders and climate change influencers. So we appreciate everything you've done to help us understand and to bring home climate change and to recognize the levels of impacts we're facing and the fact that we need to take action together and that we can take action together. So thank you so much, Jim.
My pleasure.